On the evening of May the 8th, 1945, the prophecy came true. Joseph Goebbels had been dead for over a week by then, having taken cyanide in Hitler's bunker as the Soviet army closed in on Berlin. But as German officers stood in their homes and barracks across the shattered Reich, listening to the BBC announce Germany's unconditional surrender, they witnessed something Goebbels had warned about since 1939. They witnessed the power of truth. For 6 years, the Reich Ministry of Propaganda had told them that Germany was winning. For 6 years, German radio had broadcast victory after victory. For 6 years, they had been told that the enemy's broadcasts were lies designed to undermine German morale. And for 6 years, increasing numbers of German soldiers, officers, and civilians had secretly tuned their radios to London and discovered that the BBC was telling them the truth, while their own government was lying. What those German officers heard that evening was not just the announcement of defeat. It was the confirmation of everything the BBC had been telling them for years, while Goebbels insisted it was propaganda. And as the broadcast ended, the officers who had risked execution to listen to enemy radio were left to contemplate a truth they had known, but their leaders refused to accept. The BBC's credibility was never the secret. The secret was that Germany's own people had known the truth all along and had chosen to believe the enemy over their own government. This is the story of what German officers and civilians said about the BBC, both during and after it broke Nazi control over information. The warning began with a man who understood the power of broadcasting better than almost anyone in Nazi Germany. Joseph Goebbels had been appointed Reich Minister of Propaganda in 1933, tasked with controlling all information that reached German citizens. He was 36 years old when he received his appointment. He had earned a doctorate in literature and philosophy from the University of Heidelberg. He bore the physical disability of a clubfoot from childhood, but nothing in his background prepared him for the challenge he would face from Broadcasting House in London. Goebbels believed absolutely in the power of propaganda. He had studied the techniques of mass communication, the psychology of persuasion, the methods of controlling public opinion. He had helped Hitler rise to power through masterful use of media, rallies, and messaging. When war came in 1939, he was confident that German propaganda would dominate the information battlefield. Germany controlled its own media completely. Radio stations broadcast only approved content. Newspapers printed only approved stories. Public gatherings could only discuss approved topics. Citizens who listened to foreign broadcasts faced imprisonment or execution. But Goebbels had not counted on the BBC. The British Broadcasting Corporation had been founded in 1922 as an independent public service broadcaster. Throughout the 1930s, it had built a reputation for accuracy and impartiality that extended far beyond Britain. When war began, the BBC launched a massive expansion of its overseas services. Programs were broadcast in dozens of languages. German-language broadcasts began on September 27, 1939. Less than a month after the war started, the goal was explicit: to reach the German people with accurate information about the war. The BBC understood something that Goebbels did not want to acknowledge. People who are lied to constantly eventually seek the truth, even when seeking it is dangerous. The first German-language broadcasts were modest. They aired for 15 minutes each evening, transmitted on shortwave frequencies that could be received on standard radio sets throughout Germany. The early broadcasts focused on factual war reporting, deliberately avoiding the exaggerated claims that characterized German propaganda. When the BBC reported a British victory, the details were accurate and verifiable. When the BBC reported a British defeat, it acknowledged the loss honestly. This approach seemed insane to Goebbels. Why would a nation at war admit its failures? Why broadcast information that might demoralize your own population? The answer was strategic. By telling the truth about defeats as well as victories, the BBC established credibility. German listeners who compared BBC reports with German propaganda notices began to realize that the British were more honest than their own government. Throughout 1940, as Germany conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, German propaganda celebrated an unbroken string of victories. And to be fair, Germany was winning. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible. But Goebbels made a critical mistake in how he presented these victories. German propaganda exaggerated everything. When German forces captured 10,000 prisoners, German radio announced 50,000. When the Luftwaffe destroyed 20 British aircraft, German broadcasts claimed 100. When German U-boats sank 3 merchant ships, German media reported 10. These exaggerations seemed harmless. They boosted morale and made Germany appear even more powerful than it was. But they created a credibility problem. German soldiers who had actually fought the battles knew the real numbers. Officers who had read the after-action reports knew the true casualties. When they heard German radio inflate the figures, they began to doubt other announcements. The BBC, by contrast, used conservative estimates. When British forces suffered a defeat, the BBC reported it with minimal spin. When the British evacuated from Dunkirk in May and June 1940, German propaganda declared it a catastrophic British defeat, the complete destruction of the British Army, the end of Britain's ability to continue the war. The BBC reported that approximately 338,000 Allied troops had been evacuated. It acknowledged that equipment had been lost. It admitted the operation was a retreat. But it provided accurate numbers and explained that most of the troops had been saved. German soldiers who had fought at Dunkirk heard both broadcasts. They knew German forces had captured some prisoners, but that most British troops had escaped. When they compared the BBC's honest assessment with Goebbels' propaganda, they began to question which source was more reliable. 3 observations particularly struck German listeners during the early years of the war. First, the BBC reported German victories accurately, while German radio exaggerated them. This suggested the British were confident enough to acknowledge enemy successes. Second, the BBC admitted British defeats, while German radio pretended they never happened. This suggested British broadcasts could be trusted even when the news was bad. Third, the BBC provided specific details, names, dates, and locations that could be verified, while German broadcasts often gave vague generalities that could not be checked. The pattern became clear to anyone paying attention. The BBC was broadcasting news. German radio was broadcasting propaganda. Goebbels recognized the threat. In September 1939, immediately after German-language BBC broadcasts began, he issued the Radio Crimes Decree. It became a criminal offence to listen to foreign radio broadcasts. The penalty was imprisonment and, in some cases, execution. The decree was published in newspapers, posted in public places, and announced repeatedly on German radio. Citizens were reminded that listening to enemy broadcasts was an act of treason. Neighbours were encouraged to report anyone they suspected of listening to foreign stations. Special detection vans were deployed to find illegal listeners by tracking the radio frequency tuning of nearby receivers. But the law could not eliminate curiosity. And as the war progressed, curiosity became desperate need for truth. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The initial German advance was spectacular. Wehrmacht forces captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners and advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. German propaganda declared that the Soviet Union would collapse within months. The BBC reported the German advances, but noted that Soviet resistance was fierce and that the campaign was far from over. By December 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow. Then the Soviet counteroffensive began. For the first time in the war, German forces retreated. Tens of thousands of German soldiers died in the brutal winter conditions. German propaganda minimized the setback, calling it a tactical withdrawal and winter adjustment of the front lines. The BBC reported that German forces had been driven back from Moscow, suffering heavy casualties in the process. German soldiers who had survived the retreat knew which broadcast was accurate. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the pattern intensified. German propaganda continued to claim victory after victory, even as the military situation deteriorated. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, where over 90,000 German soldiers surrendered, German radio announced it as a heroic stand against overwhelming odds, a sacrifice that had delayed Soviet offensives. The BBC reported that an entire German army had been destroyed, the war's turning point had occurred, and Germany was now fighting a defensive war it could not win. German officers who had lost comrades at Stalingrad listened to both broadcasts and recognized which one was telling the truth. The BBC did not need to exaggerate. The facts were damning enough. An entire German field army had ceased to exist. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. And soldiers throughout the Wehrmacht began to understand that their government was lying to them about the war's progress. But the BBC's influence extended beyond simple war reporting. The broadcasts included messages from German prisoners of war, read over the air so their families would know they were alive. They included lists of casualties that German authorities had not released. They included analyses of military situations that helped German soldiers understand what was actually happening. And most subversively, they included subtle psychological messaging that undermined Nazi ideology without overt propaganda. The BBC never insulted German soldiers or the German people. It drew a careful distinction between the Nazi regime and the German population. It acknowledged German military skill and bravery while questioning the wisdom of Germany's leaders. It reminded Germans that they had been a great cultural nation before Hitler and could be again after the war. This approach was devastatingly effective. Germans who expected crude enemy propaganda instead encountered respectful, accurate reporting that treated them as intelligent people capable of recognizing the truth. The expansion of BBC German-language broadcasting revealed the scale of British commitment to information warfare. By 1942, German-language broadcasts had expanded from 15 minutes per day to multiple hours across different time slots. The BBC created distinct programs for different audiences. There were news broadcasts for the general population, specialized military analysis for officers and soldiers, and even broadcasts specifically targeting submarine crews and Luftwaffe pilots. Each program was carefully crafted by native German speakers, many of them refugees who had fled Nazi persecution. These broadcasters understood German culture, German humor, German ways of thinking. They could communicate in ways that resonated with German audiences. One broadcaster became particularly influential. Thomas Mann, the Nobel Prize-winning German author, who had fled to America, began recording monthly broadcasts for the BBC in 1940. His program, German Listeners, was transmitted on shortwave and could be heard throughout occupied Europe. Mann's broadcasts were literary, philosophical, and deeply moral. He spoke to Germans as fellow countrymen who had been led astray by criminals. He reminded them of Germany's cultural heritage. He explained how Nazism had perverted German values, and he assured them that defeat would bring liberation, not destruction. Mann's broadcasts reached German intellectuals, officers, and educated civilians who might have dismissed cruder propaganda. They listened because Mann was a German literary giant, a voice of cultural authority telling them truths their own government denied. By 1943, the Gestapo estimated that millions of Germans were regularly listening to foreign broadcasts. The actual number was impossible to determine because most listening was done in secret, alone, or with trusted family members. People would gather in homes, close the windows, lower the volume on their radios, and tune to the BBC. They risked imprisonment for themselves and their families. They risked being reported by neighbours, colleagues, or even their own children who had been taught in school to inform on parents who showed disloyalty to the regime. but they listened anyway because they needed to know the truth. German soldiers on leave would secretly tune to the BBC to find out what was really happening at the front. Officers would gather in private quarters and listen to BBC military analysis that was more accurate than their own intelligence briefings. Civilians would check BBC reports against German announcements and realize that German radio was lying about food supplies, casualty figures, and air raid damage. The BBC's influence was greatest among prisoners of war. When German soldiers were captured by British or American forces, they were often stunned by the treatment they received. They had been told by German propaganda that Allied forces would torture or execute prisoners. Instead, they found themselves in camps where they were fed, given medical treatment, and allowed to listen to radio broadcasts. The BBC was played openly in POW camps. German prisoners could hear uncensored news for the first time in years. The psychological effect was profound. Prisoners who had believed German propaganda suddenly encountered reality. They learned that Germany was losing the war. They discovered that Allied bombing had devastated German cities. They heard casualty figures that explained why so many of their comrades had disappeared, and they realized that everything they had been told by their own government was a lie. The shift in POW attitudes was documented extensively. British and American intelligence officers conducted thousands of interviews with German prisoners between 1943 and 1945. These interviews revealed a pattern of disillusionment that intensified as the war progressed. Early in the war, German prisoners were often defiant, certain that Germany would win. By 1943, most prisoners expressed doubt about German victory. By 1944, many openly stated they were glad to be out of the war. The common thread in these interviews was the BBC. Prisoners repeatedly mentioned that listening to BBC broadcasts in the camps had revealed the truth about Germany's situation. One officer told his interrogators that the first thing he did after being captured was ask to hear the BBC news. He had been listening secretly in Germany for 2 years, and he wanted to hear it without fear for the first time. The Gestapo made extensive efforts to suppress BBC listening. Agents infiltrated neighbourhoods, watching for signs of illegal radio use. They monitored which frequencies radios were tuned to when they entered homes on searches. They arrested people suspected of spreading information that could only have come from foreign broadcasts. The penalties were severe. Ordinary citizens caught listening faced prison sentences of months or years. Repeat offenders could be sent to concentration camps. Those caught in the military faced military courts and potential execution for undermining the war effort. Between 1939 and 1945, thousands of Germans were arrested, imprisoned, or executed for listening to foreign radio. But enforcement was inconsistent. Local authorities had limited resources and could not monitor every home. Many Germans developed techniques to minimize risk. They would tune their radios to German stations when not in use. They would listen at low volumes with towels stuffed around the radio to muffle sound. They would listen only when alone or with trusted family members. They would never discuss what they heard outside their immediate household. Some families developed code words to warn each other when someone was listening. Others simply accepted the risk as necessary to access reliable information. The determination to hear the truth was stronger than the fear of punishment. In 1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy and Soviet armies advanced from the east, the gap between German propaganda and reality became impossible to hide. German radio continued to announce victories that never happened and minimize defeats that were catastrophic. The BBC reported the liberation of France, the destruction of German armies, the approach of Allied forces toward the German border. Germans who listened to both broadcasts understood that their country was being crushed. They heard the BBC describe battles that German radio denied had occurred. They compared the BBC's maps of Allied advances with official German announcements and realized their government was lying about the war's trajectory. Officers at the front knew the truth from direct experience, but officers in rear areas, cut off from front-line information, increasingly relied on BBC broadcasts to understand what was actually happening. The final phase of the war revealed exactly what Goebbels had feared. As Allied armies entered Germany in 1945, German propaganda became completely detached from reality. Radio broadcasts spoke of wonder weapons that would turn the tide, of reinforcements that did not exist, of strategic withdrawals that were actually chaotic retreats. The BBC reported the collapse of German defences, the encirclement of German units, the approach of Allied forces toward Berlin. German civilians trapped in the shrinking Reich had no need for radios to know the truth. They could see the refugees fleeing west, hear the artillery fire approaching, watch the German army disintegrating. But they still listened to the BBC because it told them what to expect, where Allied forces were, when the fighting might reach their towns. After Germany's surrender, Allied authorities conducted extensive surveys and interviews to understand how Germans had received information during the war. These studies, part of the broader effort to understand Nazi society and prepare for occupation governance, revealed the BBC's extraordinary influence. Survey results indicated that approximately 10 to 15 million Germans had listened to BBC broadcasts at some point during the war. In the war's final year, the number of regular listeners may have reached 15 million or more. These figures represented a significant portion of the German adult population. The BBC had become the most trusted source of information in Germany, despite being an enemy broadcaster and despite the severe penalties for listening. German officers who were interrogated after the war spoke candidly about the BBC's credibility. A Wehrmacht colonel told American interrogators that by 1943, officers at his headquarters routinely listened to the BBC to get accurate situation reports. He explained that German intelligence reports were often delayed, filtered through propaganda channels, or simply false. The BBC provided timely, accurate information that helped them understand the strategic situation. Another officer described listening to BBC military analysis and finding it more sophisticated than German briefings. The BBC's commentators understood modern warfare, explained Allied strategy clearly, and provided context that German propaganda lacked. A Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down in 1944 said the most shocking thing about being a prisoner was discovering that the BBC had been telling the truth all along. He had listened occasionally in Germany, but always assumed the broadcasts were partially propaganda. In the POW camp, he had access to newspapers, maps, and uncensored information. He compared what he was learning with what the BBC had reported months earlier. The match was nearly perfect. The BBC had accurately described German military losses that German radio had never acknowledged. It had correctly predicted the trajectory of the war. It had told the truth when his own government had lied. The realization was devastating. He had fought and risked his life for a regime that had deliberately deceived him about everything. Civilians interviewed after the war described similar experiences. A woman from Hamburg said her family had started listening to the BBC after the first major air raids in 1943. German radio had minimized the damage and claimed that air defenses had shot down most of the attacking bombers. But she could see the destroyed buildings, smell the smoke from burning neighborhoods, and count the casualties in her own street. When the BBC reported that hundreds of bombers had struck Hamburg and caused massive damage, she knew it was accurate because she had witnessed it. From that point, her family trusted the BBC more than German radio for all war news. A former Hitler Youth member described his disillusionment. He had been a fervent Nazi believer as a teenager, accepting everything he was taught in school and youth organization meetings. But his father had secretly listened to the BBC and occasionally shared information with him. At first, he reported his father to his Hitler Youth leader, but the leader told him to ignore it unless his father spread defeatist statements publicly. Over time, he began to notice that events his father predicted based on BBC broadcasts came true, while events predicted by German propaganda did not. By 1944, he was listening to the BBC himself, realizing that the regime he had idolized had been lying to him throughout his youth. The fundamental truth that emerged from these interviews was simple and stark. A government that consistently lies to its people eventually loses their trust. The Nazi regime had created a sophisticated propaganda apparatus that controlled all official information. But it had made the critical error of assuming that control over information channels meant control over belief. Germans could not access uncensored German sources, but many could access foreign sources. And when they compared those sources with official propaganda, they discovered that their own government was systematically deceiving them. The BBC did not have to convince Germans that Nazism was evil. It simply had to report the truth about the war. The truth was damning enough. Goebbels never fully grasped why the BBC was winning the information war. His diaries show that he was aware of the BBC's influence and frustrated by his inability to counter it. He ordered German radio to attack BBC credibility, calling it Jewish propaganda and enemy lies. He demanded that listening be punished more severely. He created counter-programs designed to discredit foreign broadcasts. But he never understood the fundamental problem. The BBC was credible because it told the truth. German propaganda was not credible because it lied. No amount of clever messaging could overcome that basic asymmetry. You cannot convince people to disbelieve what they can verify with their own experience. In the final days of the war, as the Reich collapsed, Goebbels remained in Berlin with Hitler. On May 1st, 1945, one day after Hitler's suicide, Goebbels poisoned his 6 children and then had himself and his wife shot by SS guards. He chose death over witnessing the complete defeat of the regime he had served. He never heard the BBC broadcast the news of Germany's unconditional surrender. He never learned how thoroughly his propaganda apparatus had failed. But German officers and civilians throughout the shattered Reich did hear that broadcast. And many of them, having listened secretly to the BBC for years, felt a sense of relief that the lies had finally ended. The lesson of the BBC's triumph over Nazi propaganda extends beyond World War II. Goebbels possessed extraordinary skill in propaganda and media manipulation. He controlled the most sophisticated information apparatus in the world. He had the power of a totalitarian state behind his messaging. But he was defeated by an enemy broadcaster that simply told the truth. The BBC proved that in the long run, accuracy defeats propaganda. People who are intelligent enough to fight a war are intelligent enough to recognize when they are being lied to. And when they discover that their own government is lying while the enemy is telling the truth, they will choose truth over loyalty. As those German officers listened to the BBC announce their nation's surrender that May evening, they understood something that their leaders had never grasped. The BBC had not defeated Germany militarily. Allied armies had done that. But the BBC had defeated the Nazi regime's attempt to control information and maintain the illusion of inevitable victory. It had provided Germans with the truth when their own government would not. And in doing so, it had demonstrated that free, honest journalism is more powerful than even the most sophisticated propaganda machine. If you found this account of the BBC's influence on German officers and civilians valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. We are dedicated to bringing you accurate historical content based on verified sources and documented testimony. Share this video with others who appreciate understanding history from multiple perspectives and leave a comment telling us which aspect of World War II information warfare you would like us to explore next. Your support allows us to continue producing educational content that brings important historical lessons to new audiences.